In a previous video, we introduced the idea of reliability and validity. And as we were talking about reliability and validity, we were talking about errors in our research. That is where we collect data from our sample from a smaller group. And when we collect that data from the smaller group, it doesn't truly represent the population in terms of characteristics, in terms of attitudes, in terms of how they would answer the questions. That's error. Error is when the sample doesn't match the population. And there are different reasons for this error, which we talked about previously. We have random error, which is transient in nature. The idea that some of the people who respond to your survey will be in a good mood and some of them will be in a bad mood. Those who are in a bad mood are going to be overly negative in their opinions. Those who are in a good mood are going to be overly positive. The idea here with random error is that if you have a big enough sample size, then they kind of cancel each other out. Those who are more critical, those who are being impacted by situational factors, all of that kind of cancels out each other or is unique for that one individual. It's an outlier. And so because of the bigger sample size, it doesn't really sway the overall results. Okay, we're okay with some random error. And we have a big enough sample size. We'll talk about sample size in a later video to make sure that we have dealt with that. Then we need to look at systematic error. So with systematic error, what we are looking at is either measurement error. This is error that results from variations between the information being sought and what is actually obtained. So when we look at measurement error, and this is where we talked about before, that reliability and validity in our measurement tools, we need to make sure that the tools we use actually answer the questions that we have, that they give us the information we're actually looking for. So that was our measurement error. And then we have sample design error. Sample design error is a type of systematic error that results from errors in how we choose our sample. So the sampling procedure. Since we've already talked a bit about measurement error, let's focus here on our sample design error first, and then we'll go into more examples of measurement error. So let's look here at sample design error. So when we talk about sample design error, we have selection error, population specification error, and frame error. So let's start here. And let's first define that sample design error. So sample design error is a systematic error that results from an error in the sample design or sampling procedure. One of those types is frame error. This is error resulting from an inaccurate or incomplete sampling frame. So we need to know what it means to be a sampling frame. A sampling frame is a list of population elements or members from which units can be sampled. Units to be sampled are selected. Okay, so we specify who is that target population, that group we want to get this information from. And then we are looking for a list of individuals who should be making up that population from which to choose our sample from. So for example, let's suppose that we use a phone book as our sampling frame. If we pull names from a phone book, who is being excluded from the sample? Well, anyone who doesn't have a phone. Well, we don't even have phone books anymore, but there was a period of time in which there was population with landlines, and so they were in the phone book. And then we had the population who had switched to mobile. Now we have smartphones. And so they weren't in the phone book. So there was a problem with the sampling frame or frame error because the source we were using to basically represent the people in the population wasn't everyone in the population, and it wasn't even a subgroup that was representative of the population. It was simply a part of the population, a particular cohort. And in this case, it was people with landlines and not people with cell phones. So that meant, for example, we end up with people in our survey because we're pulling from that sampling frame, tended to be older because they had a landline and not younger because the younger people had cell phones. Another example of frame error would be in 1936. There was a poll that predicted the winner of the US presidential election. It predicted that a guy named Landon would win by a landslide. Well, the sampling frame that was used to survey about who people were voting for, that sampling frame came from a list of people who owned cars. Well, if you recognize the years 1936, you notice that's right after the Great Depression. So who during the Great Depression could afford a car? Well, it's the rich and the conservative. So by pulling participants from a list, from our sampling frame that was just rich and conservative, it was of course going to predict that a conservative person would win the US presidential election. So we need to make sure that our sampling frame is complete. We need to check our assumptions about that group that we are using to pull our participants from. Okay. The next type of sample design error is population specification error. Population specification error is an error that results from incorrectly defining the population. From which the sample is chosen. Okay. So if we are not defining the population correctly, so we really aren't specifying exactly the right group that we need the information from, then of course when you pull your sample from that group, it's not going to give you the information you need. So you do need to spend a bit of time thoroughly defining who that population of interest is. Who do you ultimately care about? What are you trying to solve? Who has that type of information? Who's informed about this? And what is it about them that kind of defines them as a group? So are there certain characteristics that we can use to identify that particular population? If I'm surveying people for collective bargaining, my population is the faculty. And so I would want to then pull the sample from all of the faculty. So I would look at what are the characteristics of the faculty. Do I have the appropriate sampling frame? That would be my list of all the faculty members. And I'm going to define that population as including the full-time faculty, the part-time faculty, those who teach in the summer, those who teach in the fall. And I would want to make sure that that population that's defining all of those faculty clearly defines everyone who I should be hearing from. And then I would try to get participants from all those different parts of the population. So then the next type of sample design error is selection error. And selection error is an error that results from incomplete or improper selection procedure. So let's suppose I'm doing door-to-door interviews, and as I'm walking around, I think, well, that particular house looks a little sketchy, and so I'm going to not knock on that door and try to solicit a response from them. So by skipping the rundown houses, I am not creating an environment where everyone in the population has an equal probability of being selected. Anyone in a more rundown house has a very low probability of being included in my survey, which means that there's a whole group within that population that's being excluded. So for example, if the rundown houses are going to be the poorer individuals, anyone below a certain income level is not going to be a participant in my sample, in which case the results of my survey are not going to reflect the needs, the interests, the opinions of lower income individuals. That whole group is being skipped from our analysis and from our inference. So any decisions or recommendations we make about the greater group, it's going to exclude their thoughts and the information about them. So how do we fix that? We need to ensure a more probability sample. We would have rules in terms of, you pick every third house on the right. So more in terms of random selection to ensure a more representative sample. Okay, so we've been looking here about sample design error, and we talked about selection error, population specification error, and frame error. All of these are types of systematic error here in terms of how we choose the sample. In our next one, we will look at measurement error, which we talked about a little bit in some previous videos, but we'll get into more detail the different types of measurement error.